Hello. Hello, and my name is Laura Lee, and I want to talk to you today about psychologizing the NHS. Psychologizing as a word doesn't exist. I think it's me that's made it up. Psychologizing the NHS, just very briefly, what do I mean by that? I mean bringing the psychological knowledge and the skills of delivering psychological knowledge to all of the NHS and making those skills and that knowledge available to service users and their families. I wasn't too sure how to begin. I was here last year, and I'm very aware that I am a white, middle-class, middle-aged woman. And really, I only represent myself. I represent somebody who lives with quite significant long-term mental health difficulties each year. I experience bouts of psychosis, which I do recover from, and I guess there is actually a story of hope. I wasn't sure where to start because of those things, and I decided I better start right where I am now. And right where I am now is coming out of a few weeks of being entangled with the mental health services again, and the crisis team, seeing a psychiatrist and speaking to my own psychologist. What I want to say is that those experiences were overwhelmingly positive, particularly from the psychiatrist, who was very keen to involve family members in what was happening. I think I'm really grateful for being in a country where there's an NHS and where I'm cared for, where workers, psychologists, all of you are compassionate, and I experience that compassion, and I'm very grateful for it. I guess I might need to go on to something like this that captures that image of compassion. We are really, really fortunate to have this care in this country. But there are things that go wrong, and there are things that go wrong that affect my life and my family's life and other people's lives, probably your lives too, because psychological professions and professionals are not immune from the difficulties of living with mental health challenges. And if you read this, I'm not going to read it out, you can see that the CQC is actually quite concerned about some of the care that is being received. In the last week, somebody said to me, "How did you survive this? How did you manage this on your own?" And there are a few answers to that. The first answer is that hanging around my service user involvement group, which is Capital Clients and Professionals in Training and Learning in West Sussex, I found out about managing my own mental health, and I found out that I wasn't alone. Also, hanging around with psychologists gave me new tools for managing my mental health difficulties. So I learnt things about managing my mental health, and I learnt that I wasn't alone. And none of us are alone. You as psychologists, no matter how you might be feeling today in your own teams, psychological professionals, are not alone. And that's one of the reasons why I decided that I wanted to support the PPN, because I think that there is much more power when we work together. We are not alone. So one of the other things that I haven't spoken about is in managing a mental health difficulty is vision. And it's so good to be here today to hear that beginning work last year turning into something which for me sounds a bit like a vision for the psychological professions. Vision is really important for me when I'm very, very unwell, and it actually consists of one word, and that word is courage. Courage. And perhaps that's what's needed when you try and do something different and new. And I say courage, you have got the tools to do this recovery work for yourself and in your family. But where did I get those tools from? I got them from you. And I like to speculate that part of the problem with the CQC that the CQC identified was perhaps that those NHS professionals were not able to use psychological knowledge and use their skills around psychological knowledge to deliver best care. So my vision is that perhaps they might be able to do that, and all of you are working within the NHS and may be able to support the work of psychologizing the NHS. But this involves change. Okay, I want to go, oh dear, change. Change is really difficult, but you as psychologists are working with it every day. I, as a service user, have chosen to think about change in my own life and to work for change because I know that the negative impact of my individual mental health problems on my family is really significant. I know that my family members say, you drive me around the bend when you're like this. You're so unreasonable. They can't have conversations with me and they don't have the words to have a conversation. You as psychological professions have the ability to enable me and other service users to have the words to speak about mental health difficulties. But when I'm well, I like to have a big vision. So my big vision is psychologizing the mental health psychologizing the mental health services and the NHS. And it involves something joined up that addresses both the personal, the professional, and the services, and ultimately our country. I think we can change things. I see a big change in what is acceptable for us to talk about in relation to mental health difficulties in society over the last 10 years. There has been change and there can be change. So I am about the idea of democratizing your psychological knowledge so that service users and families can have conversations and can have the tools to manage better. How will we know that this has worked? Well, here are a few suggestions. And they really are about the service user living within the context of their family, their friends, their neighbours, their community. All of us having the words so that we can manage our mental health difficulties. I think that a vision is something that can be shared, and I'm not so sure what your vision is. But mine is that as psychological professions together, you have the power to make a difference, and that by making a difference, you will impact the NHS system, and the NHS system, because it is, from cradle to grave, will make a difference in my life and in the lives of my family. So I hope, perhaps, that you'd be inspired to think about what changes you might be able to bring, and that you might be able to think differently, not just about the individual, but about the family and the service and the NHS and wider. And it was great to hear Pete's words earlier about that big system and also that smaller system, that how they all need to be working together to provide change. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. And as it says here, my name is Louisa Stewart. I'm Head of Mental Health at NHS England and Improvement. I cover perinatal mental health and children and young people's mental health. And I get to do the next layer in the sandwich of the three of us up here, which is giving the policy profession perspective. Slightly difficult to do in a pre-election period. So I'm going to be talking to you about where we are in our current journey. I'll talk to you about the long-term plan and what's in it, but it comes with a caveat that future government, once formed, may well take things in a different direction. We would very much hope that they'd want to build, whoever it is, on what we've done to date, and I think there's a very strong case for that. But what I'm going to present today is very much what was published in a plan, but please do take with appropriate caveats. Luckily, I'll get to start with what we've already done. So the long-term plan didn't come out of thin air. We published a 5-year forward view for mental health, and we're now in the 4th year of implementing that plan. We've made significant progress within it. There's a whole host of blue boxes up here setting out where we're at and what we've done. I think some things I just wanted to call out, particularly ones where I've been involved. So as we finished the 3rd year of the 5-year forward view, we had seen nearly 380,000 children and young people in NHS commissioned community services. Now, we didn't make a big song and dance at the time, but that meant that last year we hit the 5-year forward view target that we weren't due to hit until next year. And that is thanks to the efforts of services, like a number of you are involved in across the country. We've continued to deliver IAP services successfully, hitting the targets, and in another area, in perinatal mental health, we had a trajectory last year of seeing 9,000 women who previously wouldn't have been seen, and I do very much use the collective we. It wasn't me sat in a pink building in Elephant and Castle. It was people across the country doing that. So, and this is very much the foundation on which we built the long-term plan. So if we move to the long-term plan, it was published almost a year ago, and published after quite an extensive process of engagement, both public and with a number of bodies and services across the country. So very much did what people were asking us to do. And as well as publishing the high-level commitments in the long-term plan, we also published an implementation plan in July, which set out in much greater detail some of the proposals, the money that was available, assumptions around workforce. And it overlapped with the 5-year forward view. So we're currently in year 4 of the 5-year forward view, but year 1 of the long-term plan. And I like to think of the long-term plan as, if you like, turbocharging the 5-year forward view. We went from saying, our 5-year forward view trajectory for perinatal, for example, was to see an additional 24,000 women. It's taken us up to 54,000 women by each year by the end of the long-term plan. So if I'm kind of move into high-level summary for the long-term plan. So we got the funding that we asked for in it. So the funding is worth 2.3 billion a year by the final year of the long-term plan, and for that we're being expected to see an additional 2 million people each year by that period. I now have 9 slides that I'm going to run you through. Just to reassure you, I'm going to run through them really quickly, but I'm keen to run through all of them just to give you a sense of the breadth of what was in the long-term plan. So if we start with, if you like, the beginning of the life course. First one is perinatal mental health. And in perinatal mental health, again, as I said earlier, what we're doing is turbocharging the 5-year forward view offer. So that 66,000 is the total number of women to be seen each year. So in the very first year before out of the 5-year forward view, we were only seeing 12,000 women each year, so a sixfold increase, as well as increasing the number of women who are going to be seen each year. We're also extending the period, so going from 1 year post-birth to 2 years post-birth, and also extending an offer to partners, the partners to be assessed and signposted to other services. Second slide is about improving children and young people's mental health care. There's a lovely poster at the back there on educational mental health practitioners. One of my colleagues, Alex, is involved in one of the sessions this afternoon where we'll be talking about what we're managing to do in terms of extending services across schools and colleges of further education. The first educational mental health practitioners are going to be fully qualified starting next month just, so that's the first 200 plus starting to qualify next month, and there are another 200 already in training who started in September. So that is very much starting to come through. There was a commitment in the long-term plan on developing a comprehensive offer for 0 to 25-year-olds. Now, we very much recognise that the 18th birthday was just treated too much as a milestone, and that people were, if you like, not quite falling off the edge of a cliff, but really struggling as they hit that milestone. So there's a strong steer within the plan, and pilots have already started this year on looking at how do we better join up across children, young people's mental health services and adult mental health services to bridge that gap and provide better support, so that people are supported based on their need, not on the basis of their birthday and when they get to blow candles out on a cake. Then finally, 100% coverage of crisis care for children and young people by the end of the period. IAP, so continued expansion of IAP services, and this is largely driven by new evidence and data we have on the prevalence of mental health issues in our population, with a particular emphasis on older people. So our previous surveys really hadn't told us quite how many people of an older age would benefit from IAT services. So we've expanded those to take account of that. The last slide I will dwell on, but then I will accelerate a little. So we've got a commitment to reform community healthcare. Now, for most other areas of the 5-year forward view, we'd already started and were building. This is an area where we really recognised 5-year forward view, hadn't really touched on, needed to get off the ground. So we've got a commitment around reforming community mental health services for adults, and this is very much about joining up across primary and secondary care, looking at new models that will meet the specific needs, and there are pilots currently underway on achieving that. If I move on, there we go. Crisis care, I'll start accelerating. Again, building on the 5-year forward view, we're aiming for 100% coverage of 24/7 age-appropriate care by NHS 111. And pilots are currently underway testing standards for that. Support for local areas will have received investment for a local suicide reduction programme. New services for problem gambling, mental health support. We've already launched the first announcement on that. So the new National Centre for Internet and Gaming Disorders was launched just last month. Oh, thank you very much. That is exactly what I around rough sleeping. Provider collaboratives. Again, this is building on what we've already done, recognising the split between specialised commissioning and community services. Hasn't always worked as well, so we've been devolving budgets and responsibility to local providers to better manage pathways in their local areas. And then final 2 slides. The first is just to emphasise that the transformation is supported by money. I said at the beginning there's £2.3 billion worth of funding by the end of the period. And what we've done very much there is a mix of money going into CCG baselines, but also some money that's being centrally held to manage particular projects. So, for example, in terms of children and young people's mental health, there is money in CCG baselines to grow general access through the community services but the money to roll out the new programs in schools is being held centrally and managed on a central basis. And then finally, the need this is primarily driven by workforce. The costs are primarily associated with the workforce. And I just wanted to underline here the sheer scale and the sheer numbers of professionals that are going to be required to deliver these services. This is very much a rough indication. It is published, it's in the long-term plan. It's based on the modelling that we did at a national level to try and understand what funding would be required, what workforce growth would be required, and you can see that it adds up to the thousands by the end of the period. Within that, there's a strong emphasis on ensuring that we expand the psychological professions across the piece. In some areas, there are very defined programs. So for something like the educational mental health practitioners, where we have a very specific target of hitting 20 to 25% of the country, that's included within these figures. In other areas, it will be more for local areas to work out what their local needs are and how they will grow them. And with that, I will bring it to a close, because I think Adrian is then going to talk about the next steps and where we go for here. And thank you for bearing with me while I coughed and spluttered.
Thanks very much, Louisa. I believe that the long-term plan gives us an unprecedented opportunity to do what Laura has asked and invited us to do today, which is to psychologise the NHS. The public want more psychological health care. We've got excellent evidence that there are evidence-based interventions that make a difference to people's recovery across a whole range of different areas for all groups. And now we have policy demanding a rapid expansion. And by the way, unlike a lot of other professional disciplines, we have lots of very bright and able people who want to come in and work as a psychological professional. So we don't face some of those same blocks that occur elsewhere. So it's time to get organised. And I'm going to be talking to you a bit about some of the work that I've been involved in with Louisa and others nationally to help get us organised as psychological professions. And the reason we need to get organised is because very often, as I stated earlier, psychological professions have felt like they've been on the outside, shouting in. Why won't anyone listen? And one of the reasons why it's been very difficult to hear us is because we probably sounded a bit like this. So multiple different groups, we weren't even really able to describe how many of us we were in different disciplines. There's at least 8 different professional bodies. If you go and talk to one, you might get a slightly different answer to talking to another. So we needed to get into a different place to that. I'm rustling slightly, so hopefully that will help. So I'm going to be talking about the National Psychological Professions Workforce Programme. And this is a programme of work that was commissioned by Health Education England during last year and has now moved forward into a piece of national work that's overseen by a group called the National Psychological Professions Workforce Group. Louisa and I co-chair this group. And one of the things that we've been working on in this group is the development of a National Psychological Professions strategy. Believe it or not, there hasn't been one before. For some of the reasons that the cats, I think, demonstrated. So we're developing that, and we want that to be fed by the work that Pete has described of psychological professions into action, because it's no use us just making up something based on a lot of people sitting in a room somewhere. We need to absolutely have everybody's input into this. But this is where we've got to so far in developing the National Psychological Professions Strategy. It has 3 components to it, and those components are grow, develop, and lead. And so I'm going to describe in a bit more detail the work that we're undertaking to push those 3 elements forward. So in summary, grow is, as we've seen, we need to grow faster than we've ever grown before across these 12 disciplines. We need opportunities to develop in the right way. In other words, for there to be the right career and training paths that allow that development in our practice into senior roles. And we also need the right leadership at all levels of the system for the psychological professions so that we can take this whole agenda forward of psychologising the NHS. And as part of the long-term plan process, we have a people plan, which is currently being written, and this is going to be launched soon. But we have an interim people plan, which came out earlier in the year. And in the interim people plan, we had a psychological professions component. And you won't be able to read this, but this basically says we're going to do these 4 things. We're going to have a strategy, we're going to focus on grow, develop, and lead. So that's great. So this is policy. And again, I think a very helpful way of setting a frame for what we're about. So firstly, the strategy. So in development, and after the end of the pre-election period, you'll see this come out for consultation, and we're going to enable that to be fed by a parallel process of the conversation around psychological professions into action. But the vision that we've already discussed and worked up with stakeholders, including 8 professional bodies, is to improve people's lives by extending evidence-based psychological practice across the whole of healthcare. So this is an ambitious vision. As part of this strategy, we need the 12 disciplines to work together, that's enshrined within it, and we need to make sure there's more diversity in our disciplines than there has been. So I'm going to, as we go through these areas, invite you to participate in a variety of ways in these different work streams. And in this case, it's about getting into the conversation about the strategy, and PPEs into action is a key way of doing that. So please join that conversation as it goes live. Okay, so grow. So to do any of this stuff, we're going to need lots of people, and we're going to need lots of people who are going to become the psychological professionals of the future, and we're going to need the whole NHS workforce to be more psychological in outlook. And Louise has flagged some of the numbers that appeared in the mental health implementation plan for workforce. And I'm just going to talk a bit about what we're growing from and to if we're to meet these policy ambitions. So our current psychological professions workforce looks something like this, and it's current in inverted commas because we don't have very good data, and so some of this goes back a few years. But there's about 20,000 psychological professionals in the NHS commissioned workforce at the moment, and you'll see that just under half of those are practitioner psychologists, and then we've got some other big groups as well, particularly working in adult IAPT, but also in psychotherapy more broadly. And if we look in that NHS mental health implementation plan, we'll see some of these numbers that have been put out as indicative. And these are the 4 sort of biggest areas of expansion. So you'll see some big sort of mind-blowing numbers here. If we're going to meet these ambitions of increased access for children and young people, we're going to need another 2,500 psychological therapists. If we're going to meet some of the ambitions around adult severe mental health problems, we're going to need another 750 psychologists in the country. And if you look at all the areas together, it adds up to this, which is a very big number of extra psychological professionals compared to what we have now, over 8,000. So we're going from about 20,000, increasing by at least 8,000, and this doesn't include the education mental health practitioners that Louisa also referred to, where the numbers may also be dazzling. So what this looks like is something like this. Over time, so going back to 2007, we didn't have IAPT, and we were about 10,000. We're now, as I say, about 20,000, and by 2024, we'll need to be something like 34,000. So this is probably the largest expansion of any disciplines or any occupational grouping in the NHS at the moment. So, yes, we do need to grow. It's going to be an expansion like never before, in summary, and to support that, we're, as part of this national work, going to be developing an integrated workforce plan across the 12 disciplines. So rather than just planning one and in a sort of slightly separate stream planning another, we're going to be looking at all the 12 together. How many of who to do what? And supporting the processes that will enable the right commissioning to developed those trainings and those posts. So my invitation to people in the room is if you're in a role that allows you to push forward the creation of some of the new posts that are going to be required, then please create the new posts. If you're in a position that allows you to do any work to bring these 12 disciplines together, then please do so. I think it's going to be very important that we're working together on this. So the second area is develop, and this is about our practice development and how we enable the development of practitioners. And these are some of the projects that we're picking up nationally that will support that. So efficient career and training paths and guidance around that. You'll have a chance to play with the interactive career map that's in development at the moment outside when we break. And there's also a number of other projects that have been commissioned looking at how psychology graduates can have the maximum impact in the system, how we might enable psychological professionals of whichever discipline to progress through advanced practice and potentially to consultant practice, opportunities that we know aren't there for everyone at the moment, how we might more widely adopt extended roles such as multi-professional approved clinicians across the system, and how when we adopt new roles, like some of the emerging new roles we have in the system already, we ensure that those are sort of thought about and rolled out in a way that is sort of consistent with what already exists and minimises disruption to what already exists and doesn't duplicate. And last but definitely not least, we want service user and care involvement in all psychological professions training, and we're going to be running a project on that, which we have some specific funding to support. So what can we all do? We can all participate in these projects if we get the opportunity, and we can all promote the products of them. So it's an invitation to join in doing that. And the final area is lead. So what can we do to lead? Well, what we've set out and what was in the interim people plan is that we need the right leadership for the psychological professions and by the psychological professions at each of these levels. So local level, in other words, in your trust or other provider organisation, at system level, so if you work in a sustainability and transformation partnership or integrated care system, we need psychological professions being in the right conversations as part of those emerging structures. And at regional level, we have a way forward to create 7 PPNs. So there are 3 at the moment, one in Sussex, one in the northwest, and one that has just been approved for development in the southwest. But there are 7 NHS regions, and so we want to go forward with 7 PPNs to take this sort of leadership and engagement across the whole of England. And at national level, what we're after achieving is the right embedded route into policy making and policy delivery at national level, and we're exploring the different options around that at the moment. So what can we all do to engage in this? We can take up the leadership roles. We can invite others to take up leadership roles if we're in that sort of position. We can work to help establishing a PPN in your region, if you're not from this region. So get that off the ground, and you can support the right development of national leadership. So maybe the future might be harmonious, and it might involve us all being able to play the same tune with slightly different voices, our own unique contribution to it, but in a way that allows our music to be heard across the whole of healthcare. So on that note, thank you very much. And Laura has a final word to say to conclude our bit.
Okay, so I wanted to come back to the idea of vision. The thing is, about vision is that it can work on many different levels. Asking what's my personal vision can be helpful, and I don't know how you came today. You may have come here because you were looking for something, or you needed to be rested, or you needed to be inspired. but that idea of personal vision is something that sometimes helps. But vision works on many different levels. It's rather like something that disturbs a pool of water and the ripples ripple outwards. But now comes the controversial bit. So as a service user and a carer, we sometimes say controversial things. And I think there is something about having a clarity of vision. Yes, psychologise the NHS, but what sort of psychology are we asking of you as service users? Well, here's my take on it, and it is just my take on it. I think that for a very long time, psychology, along with other mental health services, has made a bit of a mistake in focusing too much on the individual and not enough on the context in which the individual lives. So I really would ask you to consider, what difference can I make in my practice now in terms of situating the work that I do within the families and communities of the people around? Really, there's no excuse these days. Nearly everybody has got a smartphone, and you can use that smartphone to invite a family member or a friend or somebody else into your work in the clinic room. The other thing is, I think that there's a tendency for all professionals to be seen and to perhaps also fall into the trap of seeing themselves as the holder of the cure or the holder of knowledge. And of course, that's what I've been talking about. Transfer your knowledge to service users and carers. I think it's really important that there's something about the idea of, well, the term that I use, but it's a really uncomfortable term, is self-management, or taking it back to many years ago when the service users talked about the idea of the recovery approach, that it is the service user and their family who holds the power to enable recovery in mental health difficulty. Or perhaps, as somebody said to me the other day, it's actually about self-care. And those concepts are still not really embedded, I think, in the NHS. So that's part of the vision too. It's part of my vision. So how do we make a vision a reality? It's difficult. And I, in my last week, was going, how are we going to get out of this situation? And one of my family members said something back to me that I said to them not so long ago, which was, set a direction, set an intention, and just start going in that direction, and you'll get there. And I think if you work together as psychological professions and you have a vision for change and for better services, then you'll get there. Thank you.